there are betrayals that announce themselves like a clap of thunder, loud, sudden, and impossible to ignore. They tear through the fabric of your life, leaving a clear and devastating path of destruction. But there are other betrayals, the kind that I've come to know, that arrive more like a fog. They seep in slowly, almost imperceptibly, blurring the edges of your reality until you can no longer distinguish the solid ground of love from the murky waters of manipulation. You don't realize you're lost until you're already soaked to the bone. Shivering in a cold you never saw coming. My story is about that kind of fog, and the painful, clarifying light that finally burned it away. I, Elisa, am 34 years old, and for most of my life, I believed my designated role within my family was that of the anchor, the steady, reliable one, the one who worked hard, saved her money, and never asked for much. Content in the belief that my quiet contributions were the bedrock upon which our family's happiness was built. It was a role I accepted without question. Because the alternative, the thought that my efforts were not just unappreciated, but entirely taken for granted, was too painful to consider. My family consisted of my mother, my father, and my younger sister, Clara, who was 3 years my junior, was the designated flame of our family, beautiful, vibrant, and tragically, perpetually fragile. Or so we were led to believe. The life I remember from just a year ago was one painted in the warm, soft hues of domestic routine. It was a life of quiet sacrifice, the kind a daughter and a sister performs not for thanks, but for the simple, humming satisfaction of a peaceful home. I remember one Saturday afternoon in late spring. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and blooming jasmine. I'd spent the better part of the day at a mechanic's shop, overseeing the costly repair of Clara's car. The bill came to just over $900, a significant sum that I knew she couldn't manage. When I finally drove her car back to the house, she was lounging on the porch, scrolling through her phone. "Oh, you're back," she said, her eyes not leaving the screen. "Did they fix the weird noise?" "They did," I replied, handing her the keys. It was the transmission, all sorted now. I held out the itemized receipt. She glanced at it, her brow furrowing for a second, not in concern, but in mild annoyance. "Wow, that's a lot," she murmured. She tucked the receipt into the pages of a magazine without a second look. "Thanks, Eli. I'll pay you back when I can." I knew she wouldn't, but like always, I swallowed the words and forced a smile. "Don't worry about it." Later that evening, while clearing the porch, I saw her laptop open on the patio table. The screen displayed the order confirmation for a designer handbag, its price tag eerily close to the $900 I had just spent. I felt a familiar, dull ache in my chest, but I quickly pushed it down. She's going through a lot, I told myself, repeating the mantra our mother had instilled in us for years. A little retail therapy won't hurt. That was the fog at work. You see, it made me rationalize the irrational. This dynamic permeated every aspect of our lives. I was the planner, the doer, the financial safety net. Clara was the one to be coddled and protected. Her chronic autoimmune disease, real, but manageable, serving as a permanent get-out-of-jail-free card for any responsibility. When it came time to plan our parents' anniversary dinner, I was the one who spent weeks coordinating, booking the venue, and paying the deposit. Claire was supposed to handle the invitations 3 days before the event. My aunt called me, asking why she hadn't received one. It turned out Clara had simply forgotten. When I confronted her, she looked at me with wide, tearful eyes. "I'm so sorry, Eli. I've been having a flare-up all week. My mind is just a mess." And before I could say another word, our mother swooped in, placing a protective arm around Clara's shoulders. "Elisa, that's enough," she said, her voice laced with disappointment. "You're the older sister. You have to be the bigger person. Her health is fragile. Don't add to her stress." I looked from my sister's artfully distressed face to my mother's stern expression, and I felt like a stranger in my own home. I ended up spending the rest of the evening calling every relative personally to invite them. I smoothed it over. That's what I did. I was the family's shock absorber. But even the strongest shock absorbers wear out over time. The first tremor of the earthquake that would shatter my world came on a Tuesday night. I was walking past my parents' study when I heard my mother's voice, low and conspiratorial, coming from inside, just sign where the lawyer marked. She was saying, "No, your father already agreed. We'll file it tomorrow." There was a pause. "Don't worry about Eliza. She doesn't need to know about this. It would only complicate things." My blood ran cold. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What didn't I need to know? What was so complicated? Just then, the door opened and my mother stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear. She saw me, and her eyes widened in a brief flash of panic before her expression hardened into a mask of composure. "I'll call you back," she said into the phone, and hung up. "Elisa, I didn't hear you come in. I was just getting a glass of water." I stammered. "Who was that?" "Just your aunt." She lied smoothly, discussing her will. "You know how dramatic she gets?" She brushed past me, leaving the scent of her perfume and 1,000 unspoken questions hanging in the air. I told myself it was nothing, and just a private conversation I had misunderstood. Looking back, I realized it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a warning. The final, irrevocable crack in the foundation of my life came on my 34th birthday. It wasn't a big celebration, just a quiet dinner at home. My father had grilled steaks, and I had baked my own cake, a triple-layer chocolate fudge, my favorite. As my family gathered around the dining table, singing a half-hearted happy birthday, I felt a fleeting moment of contentment. For a moment, we were just a family. I closed my eyes, made a wish, a simple, foolish wish for continued peace, and leaned forward to blow out the candles. And that's when it happened. From across the table, Clara, who had been sniffling all evening, leaned forward as well. A wicked, knowing glint appeared in her eyes. She took a deep, theatrical breath and then, deliberately, coughed directly into my face. It was a wet, rasping sound, and I felt the spray of it on my skin. The table fell silent. My father looked stunned. I recoiled, a mixture of shock and disgust washing over me. "Clara, what is wrong with you?" She giggled, a high, tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. "Happy birthday," she chirped, a smirk playing on her lips. "Hope you don't catch what I have." Something inside me snapped. After years of swallowing my feelings, of absorbing every slight and injustice, I finally erupted. "What is wrong with you?" I repeated, my voice rising. That was disgusting, it was cruel. But my mother's reaction was immediate and fierce. And it wasn't directed at Clara. Her chair scraped back as she stood up. Her face, a thunderous mask of fury. "Elisa, that is enough," she boomed, her voice echoing in the small room. "How dare you speak to your sick sister that way? Look at you. You've made her cry." Indeed. Clara had already crumpled, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with manufactured sobs. She coughed in my face. "On purpose," I protested. my voice trembling with disbelief. "You are overreacting," my mother declared, her voice cold as ice. "She is ill, and you are being selfish and cruel. You have ruined your own birthday party." She pointed a trembling finger towards the hallway. "Go to your room. Actually, no, go up to the attic. You can spend the rest of the evening clearing out that junk up there. Maybe some hard work will teach you some compassion." I stared at her, speechless. My father looked down at his plate. Refusing to meet my eyes, Clara peeked through her fingers, and in that fleeting moment, I saw it not sadness, but pure, unadulterated triumph. I had been dismissed. On my own birthday, I had been punished for being the victim of my sister's malice. As I walked out of the room, leaving the uneaten cake and the dying candlelight behind me, I felt a profound and terrifying shift. The fog was beginning to lift, and I was starting to see the monsters that had been living in it all along. The stairs to the attic creaked under my feet, each sound a protest in the heavy silence that had fallen over the house. The air grew thinner, warmer, and thick with the smell of dust and decaying paper. The scent of things forgotten. The attic was our family's unconscious mind. A repository for everything we no longer wished to see: broken furniture, outdated clothes, and boxes upon boxes of memories deemed too cumbersome to keep in the light. As I pulled the string for the single bare bulb, casting long, distorted shadows across the rafters, I felt a bitter ironie. I, too, had been sent here, relegated to the darkness with the rest of the unwanted things. For a while, I just stood there, letting the humiliation wash over me. I could hear the faint murmur of voices from downstairs, the clinking of forks against plates. They had simply continued without me. My birthday dinner, my favorite cake. All of it was proceeding as if I had never been there at all. A hot, angry tear traced a path through the dust on my cheek. I made one last, desperate attempt to appeal to reason. I went to the top of the stairs and called down, my voice tighter than I intended. "Mom, can we please talk about this?" A few moments later, my mother appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her face set like stone. She didn't climb up, she spoke to me from a distance, as if addressing an unruly subordinate. "There is nothing to talk about, Elisa. You owe your sister an apology. She is 31 years old." I said, my voice trembling. "She knows what she did. And you know it too. Why do you always do this? Why do you always let her get away with everything?" My mother's eyes narrowed. She took a few steps up, just enough so that her face was level with my knees. "I do it," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss, "because she needs me. She is vulnerable. And you, Elisa, you are supposed to be the strong one. But all I see right now is jealousy. You've always been jealous of the attention she gets." She shook her head, a gesture of profound disappointment. "You are just being too sensitive." That was the moment. That was the precise moment the last vestiges of my hope for fairness died. It wasn't a loud, dramatic death. It was a quiet, internal surrender. It was in that moment I realized that speaking the truth to someone who benefits from your silence is a useless exercise. There was no argument I could win, no evidence I could present that would be more powerful than their need to believe the fiction they had created. I was the strong one, and she was the weak one. That was the story, and they were sticking to it. "Okay?" I whispered, the fight draining out of me completely. "Okay? Mom." She seemed satisfied with my submission. "Good," she said, turning to go back downstairs. "Don't come down until you're ready to act like an adult and apologize." Left alone in the oppressive silence of the attic, I felt a numbness spread through me. I began to move mechanically, shifting boxes, lifting old dust covers. I wasn't cleaning to obey her. I was cleaning to have something, anything, to do with my hands, to distract from the hollow ache in my chest. I wasn't looking for answers. I was just looking for a distraction. But sometimes, answers find you, whether you're ready for them or not. In the farthest corner, tucked under a grimy canvas tarp, was my grandmother's old steamer trunk. It was made of dark, heavy wood, bound with tarnished brass fittings. My grandmother had been the other anchor in my life, a source of quiet strength and unconditional love before she passed away 10 years ago. A wave of grief, fresh and sharp, hit me as I ran my hand over the dusty lid. On a whim, I unlatched it. The inside smelled of cedar and lavender. It was filled with her things, old photo albums, stacks of letters tied with faded ribbon, her favorite knitted shawl. I sat on the floor. Pulling out an album, there she was. Younger, smiling, with a baby in her arms, my mother. Then a picture of me and Clara as children, dressed in matching dresses, my arms slung protectively around my little sister's shoulders. A bitter smile touched my lips. I had been playing this role for a very long time. I spent what felt like hours lost in that trunk, sifting through the remnants of a life well lived. It was a comfort, a balm on the raw wound of the evening's events. At the very bottom, beneath a stack of old linens, my fingers brushed against something hard and leather-bound. I pulled it out. It was a diary. Her diary. The cover was worn, the leather soft as silk. I opened it carefully. Her handwriting was elegant. A beautiful, looping script from a bygone era. I flipped through the pages, catching snippets of her life, her thoughts, her worries. Then, a page, dated just a few months before she passed, caught my eye. My own name was on it. I began to read, my breath hitched in my throat. The dust motes dancing in the single beam of light from the attic window seemed to stand still. October 12th. The entry began. I had a long talk with my lawyer today. Mr. Abernathy, I am setting up the final provisions for the girls. I worry about them. I worry about my own daughter. How easily she is swayed by sentiment. How she always favors the squeaky wheel. Clara is charming, but she has a streak of carelessness in her that frightens me. Eliza is the quiet one, the steady one. She carries the weight of them all, and no one seems to notice. It is a dangerous dynamic. My hand started to shake. I had to grip the book with both hands to keep reading. For that reason, the entry continued. I have made a decision. I cannot leave the house. My greatest asset, in my daughter's hands. She would surely be convinced to give it all away to whichever child cried the loudest. Therefore, Mr. Abernathy has drawn up the papers. The house is to be placed into an irrevocable trust. My daughter and her husband will have the right to live there for the remainder of their lives. But they will never be the legal owners. They will be tenants in a house that is not theirs to sell or give away upon their passing. The trust will dissolve, and the property, along with its contents, will be divided equally. 50% to Eliza, 50% to Clara. It is the only way I can be certain that Eliza is protected. It is the only way to ensure fairness. I read the passage again, and then a third time. The words on the page swam before my eyes. Irrevocable trust, not theirs to sell or give away, divided equally. Suddenly, the overheard phone call. My mother's panicked expression. Her lie about my aunt's will, it all snapped into a horrifying, crystal clear focus. Eliza doesn't need to know about this. It would only complicate things. It would complicate things because the thing they were doing was illegal. They weren't updating a will. They were trying to orchestrate a theft. My theft. They were conspiring with my sister to steal my inheritance. My birthright. The final gift of protection from the one person in my family who had truly seen me. I sat there, on the cold, dusty floor of the attic, the diary clutched in my lap like a holy relic. The shock was so profound it left no room for tears. It was a cold, sharp, and utterly devastating clarity. The foundation of my world hadn't just cracked. It had been a lie from the very beginning. The fog was gone, and in its place was the blinding, the brutal light of the truth. My own mother was trying to disinherit me. And my sister, my sweet, fragile sister, was holding the knife. I don't know how long I sat on that attic floor, suspended in the cold vacuum of the truth. It could have been minutes or an hour. Time had lost its meaning. The only thing that existed was the damning ink on the brittle page and the echoing betrayal in my heart. Eventually, the numbness receded, and what rushed in to fill its place was not the hot, explosive rage I would have expected. It was something quieter, colder, and infinitely more dangerous resolve. I carefully placed the diary back into the cedar-scented trunk, nestled it beneath my grandmother's knitted shawl as if tucking a sleeping child into bed. I closed the lid, the sound of the brass latches clicking shut, echoing like the cocking of a gun. Then I stood up, brushed the dust from my clothes, and walked down the stairs. The scene in the dining room was one of strained silence. My father was nursing a drink, staring into the middle distance. My mother and Clara were picking at the remnants of my birthday cake, their conversation dying the moment they saw me. They looked up, their faces a mixture of defensiveness and apprehension, clearly expecting a second round of hysterics. I gave them something else entirely. I walked to the table, my posture straight, my expression serene. I looked directly at my sister. "Clara," I said, my voice even and calm. "I am sorry. You are right. I overreacted." I then turned to my mother. "And I'm sorry for ruining the evening. Mom, it won't happen again." The effect was instantaneous and profound. Clara, who had been gearing up for another performance of victimhood, looked utterly bewildered. My mother, disarmed by my sudden capitulation, could only blink in response. They saw my apology as a sign of defeat, a white flag of surrender. They had no way of knowing it was my declaration of war. My father looked at me, a flicker of something concern in his eyes, but he said nothing. "Well," my mother finally stammered, "recovering. That's very mature of you. Dear, now, let's just forget this whole unpleasantness." But I wouldn't forget. Back in my room, I closed the door, and the mask of placid submission fell away. The grief was still there, a heavy, cold stone in the pit of my stomach. It was the grief of mourning a family I realized I had never truly had. I allowed myself to feel it, to let the full weight of the betrayal crush me for a few minutes. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked out the window at the dark, sleeping houses of our neighborhood, and as I stared into the blackness, the sadness didn't disappear. It simply crystallized. It condensed from a formless, suffocating gas into a single, hard, diamond-sharp objective. I would not let them win. My grandmother had not left me a weapon. She had left me a map. And now, I had to learn how to read it. I was a paralegal. I spent my days navigating the labyrinthine corridors of property law and estate planning. I wasn't a fighter, but I was a researcher. I was meticulous. And for the first time in my life, I was going to use my skills to protect myself. I retrieved the trunk key from a small dish on my dresser and went back up to the silent attic. This time, I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for a name. In a bundle of old correspondence, I found a letter from the law firm of Abernathy, Finch, and Stewart regarding the establishment of the Eleanor Vance Trust. The next morning, I woke up before anyone else. I dressed for work, my movements precise and deliberate. It was the most important day of my life, and I made the most important phone call of my life from the parking lot of a grocery store. My voice as steady as if I were ordering a coffee. "Good morning," I said to the receptionist. "My name is Eliza Vance. I am a beneficiary of a trust established by my late grandmother, Eleanor Vance, which I believe your firm administers. I need to schedule an urgent meeting with Mr. Abernathy." 2 days later, I was sitting in a plush leather chair in a wood-paneled office that smelled of old books and success. Mr. Abernathy was much older than I expected, with kind, discerning eyes behind a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. He remembered my grandmother vividly. "Eleanor was a remarkable woman," he said, a fond smile on his face. "Sharp as a tack and knew her own mind. She loved you and your sister very much. She just wanted to ensure you were both always protected." I took a deep breath. "Mr. Abernathy, I have reason to believe that the terms of her trust are being violated, that an attempt is being made to fraudulently transfer the deed of the property." His kind expression hardened into one of professional gravity. He listened without interruption as I laid out the events of the past few days, my voice never wavering. When I was finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then, he rose, went to a massive filing cabinet, and retrieved a thick, bound document. He laid it on the desk between us. "The Eleanor Vance Irrevocable Trust. Your grandmother was not only sharp, Elisa," he said, his voice low. "She was prescient." He flipped through the pages, his finger tracing the dense legal text until he found what he was looking for. She confirmed everything I already knew: the ownership, the terms, the equal split. But then he showed me the weapon. He pointed to a small, unassuming paragraph on page 14. Section 9, subsection B. "Your grandmother insisted on this," he said. "It's what we call a malicious acts clause. It's not standard. But she was adamant." He adjusted his glasses and read the words aloud. And with each word he spoke, the balance of power in my world shifted irrevocably. Should any beneficiary be found, by a court of law or by the trustee's sole and final determination, to have acted with malicious intent to defraud, coerce, or otherwise deprive another beneficiary of their rightful and designated share of this trust, said, offending beneficiaries' own claim to the assets herein may be rendered null and void, with their share being absorbed by the remaining non-offending beneficiary." End quote. He looked up at me over his glasses, his expression serious. "Elisa," he said, "what this means is that if your sister is proven to be knowingly attempting to steal your half of the inheritance, she stands to lose everything." I sat back in my chair, the air leaving my lungs in a silent rush. This was it. This was the key. My grandmother hadn't just built me a shield, she had forged me a sword. A sword that could sever not just my sister's claim, but the entire rotten foundation of deceit our family had been built upon. I walked out of that law firm, not with a smile of triumph on my face, but with a look of cold, hard, and absolute certainty. The quiet storm inside me now had a name, and it was about to make landfall. The days that followed my meeting with Mr. Abernathy were a masterclass in quiet transformation. On the surface, I was the same Eliza. I went to work. I came home. I sat at the dinner table. But the role I played had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the family's shock absorber. I had become a mirror. I reflected back exactly what was given to me, and nothing more. When my mother asked me to run an errand for Clara, I'd politely reply, "I'm sorry. I have a deadline for work. Clara will have to manage." When Clara would complain about a headache and leave her dirty dishes on the table, I would simply wash my own plate and leave hers sitting there. My family noticed the change. Of course, they just misinterpreted it. They thought it was sadness, a prolonged sulk after the birthday incident. They didn't recognize it as strategy. This new, detached. Eliza made them uncomfortable. They were used to a daughter and a sister who would fill every silence, solve every problem, and absorb every inconvenience. My polite refusal to do so created a vacuum, and it was a vacuum they didn't know how to fill. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the first gear of my grandmother's intricate machine had begun to turn. As the trustee, Mr. Abernathy sent a formal letter to the county registrar's office. It was a simple, legally sound inquiry, stating that as the administrator of the Eleanor Vance Trust, he had reason to believe an unauthorized transfer of title for the property at our address might be in process, and requested that a temporary hold be placed on any such filings pending his review. It was a small, au précis, and devastatingly effective move. It was a ripple sent across a still pond, and I knew it would eventually grow into a wave. About a week later, I was in the kitchen making tea when Clara stormed in, waving a piece of mail. "This is ridiculous," she announced to no one in particular, slapping the letter down on the counter. "Stupid government red tape is holding everything up." I glanced at the letter. It was from the county registrar, embossed with an official seal. I could see phrases like discrepancy in title filing and temporary administrative hold. I felt a thrill, cold and sharp, but my expression remained placid. "What is it?" I asked, feigning mild curiosity. "Oh, it's just some bureaucratic nonsense about the house," she said dismissively, though her eyes betrayed a sliver of anxiety. "Mom and Dad's lawyer is so incompetent. He probably filed the wrong form." She was trying to project an air of confidence, of someone dealing with a minor annoyance, but I could see the way her fingers nervously tapped against the envelope. The seed of doubt had been planted. She studied my face, looking for a reaction. Finding none, she pressed on. "Hey, you work with all that legal stuff." "Right. What does encumbrance on the title mean?" This was the moment. The first test. I took a slow sip of my tea. "It can mean a lot of things," I said vaguely. "Un lien, an easement, a restriction in a will. It just means a third party has a legal claim of some kind on the property. It clouds the title." "Well, how do I get rid of it?" she asked, her voice sharp with impatience. I shrugged, turning back to the kettle. "I'm not sure. That's not my area of expertise. You should probably ask the lawyer who handled the transfer." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before adding, "I'm sure he knows what he's doing." I hung up the phone, my heart beating a little faster. It was the first move in a game she didn't even know she was playing. Her frustration was palpable, even through the phone line. She was used to me having all the answers, to me fixing her problems. My calm, unhelpful politeness was a foreign and unnerving language to her. But Clara's arrogance was a powerful and blinding force. After a few days of fuming, she convinced herself and my mother that the letter was simply a fluke, a bureaucratic delay that would sort itself out. Her grand plan was too perfect to be derailed by something so mundane. She decided to proceed as if nothing had happened. Her next step was to find a real estate agent to get the property valued. The first step towards listing it for sale. I learned about this one afternoon when I overheard her on the phone in the living room, speaking in the loud, Self-important voice she used when she wanted to be noticed. Yes, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths. She was saying, excellent condition. I'm looking for a quick sale. Of course. I'm thinking of listing around $900,000, but I'm open to advice. She laughed, a sound that was both brittle and triumphant. Yes, I am the sole owner. I stood in the hallway, listening to her paint a picture of a future built on a foundation of lies, and I felt nothing but a profound, cold pity. She ended the call and announced that a top agent from a prestigious local firm would be calling her back within the hour to discuss a strategy. She made herself a celebratory cup of coffee and sat by the phone, a queen waiting for tribute from her subjects. The call came 20 minutes later. I was in the next room, pretending to read. But every nerve in my body was attuned to the conversation. I heard her cheerful, professional greeting. I heard the murmur of the agent's voice on the other end. And then I heard the long, drawn-out silence. I risked a glance around the doorframe. Clara was sitting perfectly still, the phone pressed to her ear. The smug, confident smile had frozen on her face, and it was beginning to crack. The color was draining from her cheeks, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen. What do you mean? I heard her whisper, her voice thin and reedy. There was another pause as the agent spoke again. No, she said, her voice barely audible now. That can't be right. There must be a mistake. Her hand was trembling. The phone slipped slightly from her grasp before she tightened her grip. She stood up, her movements stiff and jerky, like a marionette whose strings had just been cut. She didn't say goodbye. She just ended the call, placing the phone back on its cradle with a hand that shook so badly it rattled the plastic. She stood there for a long time, staring at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. The smugness was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that was left was the raw, stark terror of someone who had just looked over the edge of a cliff and realized they were standing on thin air. It wasn't a mistake. She knew it. It was an attack. And for the first time in her life, my sister Clara had no idea where it was coming from. Panic is not a quiet or dignified state. It is loud, ugly, and utterly irrational. The moment Clara understood that the obstacle in her path was not a mistake but a deliberate act, the veneer of her sweet fragility evaporated, and the raw, grasping creature beneath was laid bare. She stormed through the house like a hurricane, slamming doors and shouting into her phone. Her first target was our mother. "You messed it up," I heard her shriek from the living room. "You must have said something wrong to the lawyer. He was supposed to make it airtight." My mother's voice was a frantic, placating murmur. But Clara was inconsolable. She wasn't seeking comfort, she was seeking a scapegoat. When their circular argument yielded no results, they turned their combined fury on the only other possible suspect, me. They confronted me in the kitchen. Clara's face was blotchy and red. Her eyes narrowed with accusation. My mother stood behind her, a furious and protective sentinel. "You did this." Clara spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Somehow, you did this. I don't know how, but you are trying to ruin my life." I continued to calmly butter a piece of toast. "Clara, I have no idea what you're talking about," I said, my voice infuriatingly level. "You're the one who told me the house was yours. If there's a problem with the title, that sounds like a problem for you and your lawyer." "Don't you play dumb with me?" she screamed. She then switched tactics, her voice cracking as she clutched her chest. "How could you be so cruel to your own sister, your sick sister? All I want is a little security. And you're trying to take it away from me." My mother chimed in right on cue. "Elisa, this has gone far enough. Whatever petty jealousy you're holding on to, you need to stop it right now. You are tearing this family apart. I took a bite of my toast, chewing slowly before I answered. I looked at them. This two-headed monster of manufactured victimhood and blind enablement. She was looking at me, but she wasn't seeing a sister. She was seeing an obstacle. And for the first time, it was an obstacle she couldn't charm, bully, or guilt into moving. I'm not doing anything, I said simply. I'm just eating my breakfast. My refusal to engage, to rise to their bait, drove them into a frenzy. It was then that they made their fatal error. In their shared panic, they decided they needed to force the issue. They concluded that the only person who could fix this was the lawyer who had created the problem in the first place. Their arrogance was so profound that they believed they could intimidate or bribe him into making this legal nightmare disappear. They left the house in a whirlwind of angry whispers and slamming doors, on their way to commit their second, and far more serious, crime, conspiring to cover up the first. While they were gone, a strange quiet fell over the house. My father, who had been a silent observer to the morning's drama, and came into the kitchen. He looked older than I had ever seen him, the lines on his face etched deep with worry. He avoided my eyes, focusing instead on the coffee maker as he poured himself a cup. She seems unwell, he said, his voice gruff. She's panicking, I replied. He was silent for a moment. Then he turned to me, his expression unreadable. Elisa, he asked, his voice low. Is there something you're not telling me? It was the first time in years my father had asked for my perspective on anything. It was a small crack in the dam, but it was a crack nonetheless. I knew then that the foundation of their united front was beginning to crumble. I could have told him everything right then. I could have laid the diary and the trust documents on the table and ended it. But I knew, instinctively, that he wasn't ready to hear it from me. He needed to see the truth for himself. I think, I said carefully, that Mom and Clara have made some decisions without considering all the consequences. And I think those consequences are starting to arrive. I let the words hang in the air, an invitation he wasn't yet ready to accept. He just nodded slowly and walked out of the room. The climactic scene of my mother and sister's desperate pilgrimage happened, as I later found out, in the sterile, beige carpeted reception area of their lawyer's suburban office. They didn't have an appointment, but they demanded to be seen. When the lawyer, a slick, nervous-looking man named Mr. Klein, finally emerged, he did not invite them into his office. He met them in the lobby. According to the receptionist, who later recounted the story to a friend who knew a friend of mine, my mother began by demanding he fix the title issue immediately. Clara, for her part, apparently threatened to report him to the Bar Association for incompetence. Mr. Klein, who had undoubtedly received a copy of the same inquiry from Mr. F. Abernathy's highly respected firm, went pale. He was not a legal mastermind. He was a corner cutter, a specialist in quick and dirty paperwork. The last thing he wanted was the scrutiny of a top-tier law firm or a state ethics board. He saw my mother and sister not as clients to be protected, but as a ticking time bomb that was about to blow up his entire career. He held up his hands, cutting them off mid-sentence. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Our professional relationship is terminated, effective immediately. What my mother gasped. You can't do that. I can, and I have, he said, his eyes darting around the empty lobby. I was retained to file a standard quitclaim deed. I was not made aware that you, as the grantors, did not possess the legal right to execute that transfer. What you are describing is fraud. Attempting to circumvent an irrevocable trust is a serious offense. He took a step back, creating as much distance as he could. You have exposed me to significant professional risk, and I will not be a party to it. We are done. Please see yourselves out. He turned and walked back into his office, the door clicking shut behind him with an air of absolute finality. My mother and Clara were left standing in the middle of the lobby, stunned into silence. The ally they had counted on had not only abandoned them, but he had also given their crime a name. It wasn't a mistake anymore. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was fraud. The storm was no longer a distant threat on the horizon. It had just broken directly over their heads, and they were standing in the open, with absolutely nowhere to hide. The aftermath of the lawyer's dismissal was a thick, suffocating blanket of silence in our home. The frantic energy of Clara's initial panic had curdled into a sullen, volatile resentment. She would drift through the house like a ghost, her face pale and pinched, her eyes burning with an unspoken fury that she directed at me whenever she thought no one was looking. My mother, in turn, had entered a state of agitated denial. She would try to initiate conversations about trivial things, the weather, a neighbor's new car, her voice unnaturally bright, as if her cheerfulness alone could plaster over the gaping cracks in our family's foundation. But the moment the conversation faltered, her gaze would find me, and it was filled with a cold, hard accusation. I knew that this stalemate could not last. Clara and my mother were trapped in a feedback loop of blame and self-pity, and my father was trapped with them. A silent hostage in a war of attrition. I couldn't force him to see the truth. Forcing a person to see something they are not ready to accept only makes them shut their eyes tighter. But I could place the truth directly in his path and trust that, eventually, his conscience would trip over it. That evening, I assembled my evidence. It wasn't an elaborate presentation, just a simple, irrefutable narrative told in 3 parts. The first document was a high-quality copy of the key page from my grandmother's diary, her elegant handwriting clear and undeniable. The second was a clean copy of the trust document itself, with the malicious acts clause highlighted in yellow. The final piece was the most damning. It was a simple 2-column ledger I had created. The left column listed, by date, the 5 separate occasions over the past year that Clara had borrowed significant sums of money from me for what she claimed were urgent medical expenses, a total of nearly $4,000. The right column, corresponding to those exact same dates, contained pristine, time-stamped printouts from her social media accounts, a photo of her on a weekend spa trip, a receipt for a new designer coat, a post from a Michelin-starred restaurant. It was a quiet, devastating portrait of her deceit. I didn't add any commentary or accusatory notes. The facts were allowed to speak for themselves. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I crept into my father's small home study and placed the thin file squarely in the center of his desk, on top of the neat stack of bills he reviewed every evening. Then, I retreated, leaving the truth to wait for him in the darkness. The next day passed in that same tense silence. My father was withdrawn, his brow furrowed in thought. He barely spoke a word at dinner. I didn't know if he had seen the file, and I didn't ask. I had set my piece on the chessboard, and now I had to wait for my opponent to make his move. The call came just after 9 o'clock that night. I was in my room, reading. When my phone vibrated, it was my father. I took a deep breath and answered. "Hello. I saw what you left on my desk," he said. His voice strained and heavy. There was no anger, only a profound and weary exhaustion. It was the sound of a man who was tired of living with a lie. "We need to talk," he continued. "All of us. Tomorrow night. At the dinner table." He hung up before I could reply. The following evening, the air in our dining room was so thick with tension you could have cut it with a knife. Clara and my mother, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, were on the offensive. From the moment we sat down, my mother began by talking about how much stress Clara was under, how her health was suffering. Because of all this unpleasantness, Clara chimed in, talking about how she felt unsafe and attacked in her own home. It was a coordinated pincer movement, designed to isolate me and paint me as the aggressor. They were in the middle of this performance when my father, who had been silently staring at his plate, finally looked up. He raised a hand. A simple gesture, but it carried an authority that silenced both of them instantly. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but firm. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out the file I had left for him. He didn't open it. He just slid it into the center of the table. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. My mother stared at it, her face a mask of confusion. Clara's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition and fear dawning within them. "I have spent the last 24 hours," my father said, his gaze fixed on my mother, "reading this. And I have spent that time facing a very ugly truth, not just about Clara, but about us, about what we have allowed to happen in this house. I don't know what that is." My mother began, her voice trembling. "Eliza is trying to poison you against us." "Stop it," my father commanded, his voice rising for the first time. He finally turned his tired, sorrowful eyes to Clara. "The lying stops now. The manipulation stops now." He then looked back at my mother, and his expression was one of profound and devastating disappointment. "We were fools," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "She played us for absolute fools. And you held the door open for her every single time." It was a kill shot. My mother flinched as if she had been physically struck. All the fight, all the righteous indignation, drained out of her, leaving behind a frail, bewildered woman. She had lost her primary ally, the one person whose silence had always enabled her narrative. Clara looked from her father's resolute, unyielding face to her mother's stunned, defeated expression. The twin pillars that had held up her world of privilege and deceit had crumbled simultaneously. For the first time, there was no one to defend her, no one to make excuses, no one to blame but herself. The truth had finally broken through their fortress of denial, and my sister was left standing in the rubble, utterly and completely alone. They walked into Mr. Abernathy's conference room the following week, not as a family, but as four separate, shattered pieces of one. The room itself seemed designed to magnify the gravity of the occasion. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the grim faces seated around it. Leather-bound law books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Silent, leather-clad witnesses to the proceedings. They walked into that conference room thinking it was a negotiation. They didn't understand that it was a sentencing. I sat next to Mr. Abernathy. My posture calm, my hands resting lightly on the table in front of me. Across from us, my mother and Clara huddled together, a defensive unit, even in their defeat. My father sat at the head of the table, a grim-faced judge presiding over the ruins of his own house. "Mr. Abernathy began, his voice, the epitome of professional decorum. He laid out the legal facts in a calm, dispassionate tone. Each word, a hammer blow to my sister's already crumbling world. He explained the undeniable validity of the trust. He explained the legal definition of wire fraud and conspiracy as it related to the falsified documents. He explained the severe civil and potential criminal penalties she was now facing. As he spoke, Clara began to cry. They were not the crocodile tears of manipulation I had grown so used to. They were the hot, Desperate tears of genuine fear. My mother began to whisper frantically to her, stroking her arm. When Mr. Abernathy had finished, I spoke for the first time. There is, however, I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence, a way to resolve this without involving the courts. Clara's head snapped up, a flicker of hope in her tear-filled eyes. My mother leaned forward, desperate for a lifeline. They saw my offer as a sign of weakness, a return to the old Eliza, who would always choose peace at any price. I don't want to destroy this family. I continued, letting them believe their interpretation. So I am proposing a simple solution. Mr. Abernathy slid a single document across the table. This is a settlement agreement, he explained. In it, Clara voluntarily relinquishes all current and future claims as a beneficiary of the Eleanor Vance Trust. In exchange, the trust. And by extension, Eliza agrees not to pursue a civil suit based on the malicious acts clause. Clara stared at the document as if it were a death sentence. The hope in her eyes died, replaced by a renewed wave of desperate self-pity. Relinquish everything, she whispered. But what about me? What am I supposed to do? I have nothing. She turned her tear-streaked face to our father. Daddy, please, don't let her do this. I made a mistake. I was scared about my health. I wasn't thinking clearly. It was a masterful performance. Her last-ditch effort to play the victim card. She was trying to justify her actions, to rewrite the narrative one last time. My sister had spent her life weaponizing her words. She never imagined that one day, those same words would be turned into a weapon against her. My father listened to her plea, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, sleek object, a digital voice recorder designed to look like a pen. He placed it gently on the polished table. I believe this is what you were really thinking. Clara, he said, his voice heavy with a sorrow that was almost too much to bear. He pressed a button. Her voice filled the silent room, tinny and distorted, but unmistakably hers. It was from the day before, from a conversation she'd had with him in a desperate, last-ditch attempt to win him back to her side. I just needed to secure my future. Her recorded voice whined. Once the house was sold, I would have had enough money to get the best care. You and Mom could have moved into a nice, small apartment. I would have helped with the rent. Of course, I wasn't just going to abandon you. The recording clicked off. The lie was laid bare for everyone to hear. She hadn't been planning to take care of them. She had been planning to put them in an apartment while she absconded with nearly $1 million. My mother stared at Clara, her mouth agape. The final, painful illusion of her daughter's innocence shattering before her eyes. Clara just sat there, frozen, her face a pale mask of horror. She was exposed, utterly and completely. There were no more lies to tell, no more victims to play. It was then that I slid the agreement and a pen directly in front of her. She looked up at me, her eyes finally empty of defiance, filled only with the bleak landscape of her own ruin. Why, she whispered. The question, a ragged exhalation of breath. I leaned forward slightly, my voice low and clear, meant only for her. I'm doing this because you needed to learn that actions have consequences. I said. My gaze was steady, holding hers, and that some things, once broken, can never be fixed. I leaned back, my voice returning to its normal volume for the final, quiet pronouncement. This game was over the moment you mistook my silence for weakness. Checkmate. I watched as my sister, the golden child, the perpetual victim, The architect of my near ruin picked up the pen. Her hand trembled so violently that the first stroke of her signature was a jagged, ugly scar on the paper. But she signed it. She signed away her past, her future, and the last remnants of the life she had tried to steal. It wasn't a loud victory. There was no applause. But as I watched the ink dry on that page, I felt the heavy weight I had been carrying for my entire life, finally, blessedly, lift. The signing of a document can feel anticlimactic. It is, after all, just ink on paper. But in that quiet, wood-paneled room, my sister's trembling signature wasn't an end. It was a beginning. It was the sound of a cage door swinging open. A sound I had waited my entire life to hear, without ever knowing I was imprisoned. 6 months passed. 6 months in which the seasons changed. And with them, the entire landscape of my life. The old family home, a place that had become a monument to my pain, was sold. The proceeds were executed exactly as my grandmother's trust had dictated, managed cleanly and professionally by Mr. Beesus. Abernathy. The house and the ghosts within it were no longer my concern. I moved into a bright, airy apartment on the 7th floor of a downtown building, with a small balcony that overlooked the city. It was the first space that was truly, entirely mine. I filled it not with inherited furniture and heavy memories, but with light, with plants, and with the things that brought me joy. The silence in my new home wasn't the tense, oppressive silence of my past. It was a peaceful, healing quiet that allowed me to finally hear my own thoughts. I was promoted at work, taking on a senior paralegal position that came with more responsibility and a team to manage. I found that the same meticulous resolve I had used to dismantle my family's deceit served me well in my career. I was no longer just the reliable one. I was the respected one. I heard about Clara. Of course, through the reluctant and infrequent updates from my father. With no trust fund to cushion her, no parents to enable her, and no sister to exploit. She had been forced to face the harsh reality of the world for the first time at the age of 31. She was working a retail job at a clothing store in a mall. Her artistic ambitions and claims of fragile health conveniently forgotten in the face of rent and utility bills. I felt no triumph in this knowledge, only a distant, clinical sense of consequence. She had sown her seeds, and this was her harvest. My mother. I was told. He lived a quiet life now, with Clara no longer the center of her universe. She seemed to have lost her purpose. A queen without a kingdom. My relationship with my father evolved into something new and strange. It was a cautious, fragile thing, rebuilt one hesitant phone call at a time. The old dynamic was gone, and we were left to navigate the quiet, unfamiliar territory of two adults trying to find their footing on broken ground. The final piece of the old world fell away on a crisp autumn afternoon. It was the anniversary of my grandmother's passing, and I had driven to the cemetery to place a bouquet of her favorite chrysanthemums on her grave. As I stood there, tracing the cold, carved letters of her name, I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path behind me. It was my father. He stood a respectful distance away, his hands in his pockets. He looked older, but his eyes were clearer than they had been in years. "I had a feeling you'd be here," he said softly. We stood in a comfortable silence for a few minutes. Two mourners paying respects not only to the woman buried beneath the grass, but to the family we had lost. Finally, he stepped forward and handed me a thick manila envelope. "This is the last of it," he said. "The final accounting from the sale of the house." "Mr. Abernathy said, 'Everything is settled.'" I took the envelope. It felt heavy. Not just with paper, but with meaning. It was the tangible proof of my freedom, Your grandmother would have been proud of you, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He finally looked me in the eye. I am proud of you, Elisa. The words I had longed to hear my entire life had finally arrived, and I found, to my surprise, that while they were welcome, I no longer needed them. My own pride, hard-won and self-made, was enough. Thank you, Dad, I said, and I meant it. He hesitated, a question hanging unspoken in the air between us. Your mother, she asks about you. She wants to see you. I looked away, toward the horizon where the autumn sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A year ago, that request would have sent a jolt of guilt and obligation through me. Now, it just felt like information. I know she does, I said calmly, but maybe not yet. I need more time. I turned back to him, a gentle but firm boundary in my voice. I'm starting over. Dad. For myself? He nodded, a flicker of sadness in his eyes, but also a new understanding. He accepted my answer. He finally understood that my peace was no longer his to grant or to take away. He left a few minutes later, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stayed until the sun had dipped below the trees, and the air grew cold. As I walked back to my car, I felt a profound sense of closure, healing. I realized, isn't about erasing the scars. The scars are a part of you, a testament to the battles you have survived. Healing is about not letting those scars define your future. My family, as I had known it, was gone, but in its place, something new was growing. It was smaller, quieter, and infinitely more honest. It was a life built not on obligation or illusion, but on the simple, unshakable truth of my own worth. I had walked through the fog, and I had come out the other side. And for the first time, the path ahead was clear. Eliza's story is a powerful and often painful reminder that the deepest betrayals can come from the people who are supposed to protect us the most. Her journey teaches us a vital lesson. True strength isn't found in enduring endless disrespect, but in the courage to finally say enough. The silence of a kind person should never be mistaken for weakness. Often, it is the quiet space where a plan is being forged and resolve is being hardened. We understand that drawing a hard line with family is one of the most difficult things a person can do. If you see yourself in Eliza's struggle, please know that choosing to protect your own mental health and financial security is not selfish, it is an act of profound self-respect. You have the right to demand honesty and fairness, and you have the power to walk away from any table where love is not being served. We'd like to leave you with a question. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself from a loved one? What did you do? And what did you learn from it? Share your story in the comments below, because your experience might be the light that helps someone else find their way out of the fog. Story 2. My first wife, Susan, and I were married for 7 years with 2 children, Laura and Lucas, who were 3 and 5 years old. And we were living a normal life until one faithful morning when I was driving to my office. A speeding car from the opposite direction crashed into my car. I remember waking up on that day, and my cheating wife, who abandoned me during my hospitalization, now asks for forgiveness after 12 long years. My name is Jason M47, and I would like to share my life story here in order to get some advice. After 2 days in a coma, I woke up in a hospital bed, covered in bandages and plasters. The nurse told me that I had woken up. I thanked my doctor for saving my life and was thankful for the new life, but I had no idea of the impending disaster. After a week of treatment, my doctor told me that my lower body was paralyzed and I might never be able to walk again. I was devastated, and Susan broke down at the news. It was obviously difficult for her, as she had to take care of the house and the kids and all. I became depressed because I couldn't understand my life in a wheelchair. I spent my days staring at the empty hospital rooms and wishing that my life had turned upside down. I feared that I would never be able to dance with my wife, play soccer with my kids, or be free again. To make matters worse, Susan stopped coming to see me during the first few days I was there. She brought the kids 3 times a week. The only things I lived for were the times I spent with my family. As time went on, her visits became infrequent, and I begged her to bring the kids to see me. But she would always respond that they didn't want to. I felt helpless, and one day she gave me the divorce papers, saying, "I definitely can't spend my life with a handicapped man. I'm still young and desirable. I deserve a normal man." I would be lying if I said I didn't sense that coming, hinting at the impending separation when she began to ignore me. But I didn't anticipate that it would happen so soon, just 1 month after my accident. My friends told me that they had seen Susan hanging out hand in hand with a middle-aged man, likely in his 52nds, in cafes and shopping centers on the weekends and in the evenings. Some said that she had an affair before my accident, while others said that her desperation led her to date a fat, grumpy old man after my accident. It had only been 2 months since my accident, and I had not yet been released from the hospital when I was given divorce papers. I may sound calm as I write this, but at the time, I was distraught and upset. I was heartbroken, destitute, and divorced. I had no money or savings after paying for Amy's household expenses and the kids' schooling. Fortunately, I had insurance that partially covered my hospital bills, but I had to use my savings to cover the remaining costs, so I ended up with nothing. I don't know how I managed to stay sane at the time, but something inside of me, likely the desire for vengeance, kept me sane. I moved to my parents' house after being discharged because I was 35 years old, divorced, and financially and physically dependent on my elderly mother. She was a florist who owned a small shop in the suburbs. Her meager earnings from the shop and pension funds helped her pay her bills. With those meager resources, she provided to support me. It was the most upsetting feeling for a 35-year-old man to rely on a 2-year-old mother. Shortly after my discharge, I went to meet my kids, but when I got to my house, it was locked, and the neighbors informed me Susan had moved to her lover's house with the kids. According to my neighbors, Susan's lover was a fat old man who had been divorced 3 times, but was extremely wealthy and childless. Some even called Susan a cheapster and a gold digger for sleeping with a grumpy old man for his wealth. I was able to find out her boyfriend's address and made it to his house. But when I got to Susan's new house, she refused to let me meet my kids, claiming that they had already adapted to her boyfriend and had named him Daddy. I was living on my mother's meager income and didn't have a dime to spend on a lawyer. So I backed off when I insisted on meeting my kids. It was less than 6 months after my accident, and only a few months after my divorce, she was already living with a man. I was disgusted and asked her how she could leave me and move on so quickly. I knew I was a helpless father in a wheelchair. So what else could I do? I begged her for at least one. When I asked her if she had cheated on me before the divorce, because our divorce was finalized a month ago and she was already living with her lover, she dismissed my attempt to prove my worth by saying that I was a burden in her life and that it was none of my business. I continued to stare at her, thinking about my 7 years of marriage to that woman, who replaced me with another man within a few months. I left the place with tears in my eyes and returned home, feeling defeated by the humiliation. When I first joined my mother in her shop, I helped her make bouquets, serve customers, and clean the place. I soon realized that the business had a lot of potential to grow, but my mother was too fragile to do it herself. So I pulled out my old contacts to secure contracts with event management companies to supply flowers at the events. Gradually, I built a team and took contracts for venues. I cried like a 5-year-old in front of my mother, who comforted me and encouraged me to take charge of my life, decorations, and eventually started my own event management company. It took me 12 long years to rebuild my life for myself. But my mother was there for me through it all, encouraging me to get back up. A year after my accident, I found out that Susan was leaving the city with my kids and her lover. I hurried to the house to meet my kids, but they had already left by the time I got there. I made several attempts to contact my kids, but Susan would always insult me and push me away. Since I was physically and financially unable to contest joint custody or challenge her restraining order because I was too poor to hire a lawyer, Susan had a wealthy boyfriend named Evan. I was unsure if he had been with her prior to my accident or how he had suddenly entered Susan's life. But I did know that he was a wealthy man with a lot of ancestral property. And over the past 12 years, whenever I received any leads about my children, I traveled to meet them, but failed each time Susan threatened to have me arrested because her boyfriend had the resources and connections to get away with anything. By the way, even after 12 years of living together, that man didn't marry Susan. A year ago, I filed for joint custody while eagerly awaiting the stabilization of my event management business. I was granted 15 days, and they are flying to my house the following week. Despite Susan's best efforts to challenge my plea in court, I hired a good lawyer who made a strong case, and I was granted 15 days. In addition, my children are now adults, and when asked if they wanted to meet me, they said, "Yes, I know I can't make up for the lost 12 years, but I want to spend quality time with them." And as the time draws near, I feel both anxious and excited. They are 17 and 15 years old, and I know that teens are demanding these days. I hope my kids aren't cruel and toxic to the point of being mean. I'm not sure what stories Susan has told them over the past 12 years, and I'm not sure if I should tell them the truth about their mother. My current wife, Amy, is a gorgeous woman who I remarried 5 years ago. We met at an event where she was designing the wedding venue, and we were providing the flowers. I hadn't started my own business at the time, so it wasn't love at first sight. But we clicked well and continued to meet for such events over the next few years. Do you guys have any advice on how I approach them? I'm really anxious and excited. We dated for a year before getting married, and now we live as a happy family of 4. Amy, her daughter Mia, my mother, and I were all thrilled to have a grandmother, and my mother was too. Months later, we became friends. She was a single mother of a 3-year-old daughter. She had the idea to start the event management company because she had worked for one of the companies for many years and had the contacts and knowledge of the business hit by a speeding truck. So, ideally, I should have received compensation from the logistics company that owned the truck. However, at the time, the company got away with paying nothing by fabricating the accident's facts and placing the blame on me. Since I couldn't afford a good lawyer at the time, I didn't receive any money. Following my marriage to Amy, she advised me to resubmit the case because we could afford a qualified attorney. The case is still pending, but my lawyer has. All right, so back to my story. As I mentioned in my original post 3 months ago, my children were supposed to visit me after 12 years of my divorce. I was both excited and anxious, but Amy helped me to relax and supported me while I went to pick them up from the airport. The older one, Laura, is now 15, and the younger one, Lucas, is 13. They have grown up to be gorgeous and handsome teenagers, and after the initial greetings, we didn't talk much. It was awkward for all 3 of us on the way home from the airport. I tried to strike up a conversation by asking them about their school lives and cities, but I purposefully avoided talking about their mother. The kids were remarkably quiet, or perhaps they were just trying to use their earphones like any other teenager. When we arrived home, Amy greeted us. The kids looked surprised, as if they hadn't expected this. I'm not sure why Amy was a surprise to them when her mother could live with them. Another man, within months of our divorce. So why can't I get married again? Amy had prepared the children's guest room. We had lunch together, and she had laid out the family's vacation schedule. They responded indifferently, neither enthusiastically nor dismissively, and Amy and I were perplexed by their conflicted reaction. They locked themselves in their room, and shortly after that, their mother Susan called and accused me of deceiving our kids, saying that it brought the kids to my house so Amy and I could manipulate them. Her behavior confused me, and she accused me of concealing the truth about my marriage. I hung up on her, but she kept calling, so I decided to confront the elephant in the room. I called my kids and asked them what was wrong. And after some hesitation, they spoke up and were upset with me because they believed that I had abandoned them and that Susan had brainwashed them against me, filling their minds with all kinds of lies and deceit. I told them the truth. When I told them how Susan had vanished with them to the old man's house and how she had threatened and pushed me away whenever I tried to get in touch with them, I showed them the restraining letter and all of my rejected pleas to meet them. They were crying and felt regret for believing their mother's lies for all these years. Their mother jumped to another man as soon as she had the chance. They were still children at the time, but they remember those incidents very clearly. To me on social media. But Susan caught him. She emotionally blackmailed him and demanded that he never get in touch with me again. The kids also confessed that they had been reprimanded by Susan's husband, Susan, and that they had been mistreated at family events because they were unmarried. Susan also continued to live in his home as a mistress, even though he paid for their education. My heart ached when I learned about my kids' struggles. And after all the facts were revealed, we gave each other a hug. I couldn't be happier seeing my entire family together. Laura and Lucas bonded with Amy and Mia, who was turning 8 this year, and we went on a week-long vacation to Florida. My kids posted our group photos to social media with the caption, "Happy Family." As soon as Susan saw them, she called them out and scolded them for their stupid behavior, accusing them of betraying her by bonding with us. She then texted me, threatening to stop me from seeing my kids if I did. Anything to turn them against her. So I laughed at her hollow threats and carried on with our vacations. When my kids returned from their trip, they met up with my relatives, who graciously hosted them, and I was thrilled to see the old bonds renewed. As they were ready to leave, they said they felt suffocated living in that house and that they would move back with me after they finished high school. I gave them a hug and said goodbye. And then they confronted Susan. I hope to have them back with me, but it's been a few months since they returned. We talk frequently, so I'll let you know if anything changes. Thank you very much for the second update. I know it's been a while since I last updated, but there has been a lot of drama in the last 6 months since my first meeting with my kids 3 months ago. The pending court case with the logistic company was settled, and guess what? I received hefty compensation, not only for the accident, but I don't know if I mentioned it in the first trial because the logistics company whose truck crashed into my car manipulated the case and blamed me for the accident. So I didn't get paid at all. I appealed it again at my wife's suggestion and won this time. I told my kids about it, and they were equally thrilled. They wanted to meet me, and I promised to have them back with me permanently. A month later, Susan arrived at my office, holding my hand and pleading for forgiveness. Startled by her unexpected appearance, she revealed that she became desperate after my accident and found an elderly man who desired a sugar baby. I was unaware of all these terms until I looked them up on Google that day. The man had a string of bad experiences with a younger woman who stole his money after a few months. So he chose to settle with a 2-year-old sugar girl named Susan, who had 2 children at the time, which served as a guarantee of her loyalty. The man had made it clear that he would not marry her and would instead keep her as his mistress. When I asked Susan why she hadn't found a job, she said she had never worked and wasn't sure if she could earn a similar lifestyle that her lover gave her for free. She insisted that she did everything in her power to protect the children's future. standing on her property and claiming that the children would have grown up in poverty if she hadn't taken that step. I became so irritated with her persistent nagging that I yelled at her, saying that if she was so worried about our children's future, she should have at least given me a chance to recover. Instead of making snap judgments and leaving me without warning, she should have talked to me about it. I explained that I had moved on and her pleas didn't matter. She recapped all of our happy times together, such as our wedding day, the birth of our 2 kids, etc. I dismissed her, telling her that I was a different person now and that all of those memories had faded away and didn't mean anything to me. She claimed that she and my kids were my biological family, not Amy and Mia. She also claimed that Mia was not my daughter and that I could never have a proper family with Amy and Mia. I was disgusted by her ruthless mindset, and she insisted that I take her back so that the real family could reunite. I made it clear to her that I love Amy and Mia and that they are my real family, not her. But she refused to leave my office, making a scene. My mother and Amy were understandably upset by this. I'm not sure how her sugar daddy found out about this incident, but she is a mature woman who didn't make a big deal out of it. My mother claimed that she never liked Susan because of her selfishness. And she even claimed that the only reason Susan had come back to me was because of the money I had received after the court settled. That woman is real, a gold digger. When my children found out about her behavior, they reprimanded her and told her to stay in her lane. Cannot express how grateful I am to him. The most recent news is that my kids will be moving in with me this month. They wanted to experience college life and stay at a hostel. So I think we should stay in touch while also giving ourselves some space to get to know one another. The kids have abandoned Susan, leaving her with nothing but her sugar daddy. I hope she enjoys the sugar until it gets sour. Story 3. There are stories of betrayal that are loud and sudden, like the shattering of glass in a quiet room. They are shocking, painful, and impossible to ignore. But there are other betrayals, quieter ons, that are far more insidious. They don't arrive with a bang, but with a whisper. They are woven into the fabric of daily life, disguised as concern, hidden behind a mask of love. These are the betrayals that fester in the dark, growing stronger in our denial, until one day we awaken to find that the foundation of our entire world was built on a lie. This is a story about that kind of betrayal. It's about the devastating realization that the people who were meant to be your safe harbor were, in fact, the storm all along. I, Eleanor, 32 years old, female, always knew my family was difficult. As a professional archivist, my life is a quiet testament to order and preservation. I spend my days carefully mending the wounds of time on ancient documents, finding solace in the silent stories of the past. My own past, however, was a text I had long since learned not to examine too closely. The memories of my childhood were cold, both literally and figuratively. My parents, Margaret and Richard, had a unique method of discipline, leaving me outside in the harsh winter cold. This repeated trauma left me with a strange and permanent gift, a physiological inability to feel the cold as others do. For years, it was just a peculiar fact of my existence, a party trick, and a constant, low hum of something broken within me. I kept my parents at a distance. A carefully managed relationship built on infrequent phone calls and holidays, spent in tense civility. I believed I had found a fragile peace. I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong. The war had only just begun, and I had mistaken a ceasefire for a treaty. My life, as I knew it, truly began to unravel on a Saturday in early autumn. The air was crisp, and the leaves outside my small apartment were turning to gold and rust. I had spent the entire day at my parents' house, hunched over their dining room table, organizing a mountain of complex financial paperwork they claimed they couldn't manage. It was tedious work. the kind of detail-oriented task I excelled at, but which they had always disdained. After 6 hours, as I finally stacked the last neat pile, my mother, Margaret, surveyed my work. She didn't thank me. She simply picked up a folder, tapped it against her manicured nails, and said, "Well, at least your obsession with old paper is good for something." I felt the familiar, dull sting of her casual dismissal. But as always, I buried it. I told myself she was stressed. I told myself this was just her way. I drove home feeling that specific kind of exhaustion that comes only from spending a day pretending not to be hurt by the people you love. That was the first crack in the foundation. So small I barely noticed it. The second appeared 3 days later. My mother called, her voice a little too bright, a little too cheerful. She mentioned she had been in my neighborhood for a doctor's appointment and had thought about stopping by. I thought nothing of it until that evening, when I received a text from my neighbor, a kind older woman named Jane. "Hi, Ellie." It read, "Your mother stopped by today. She seems very worried about you. She was asking everyone about your work schedule and, well, your habits." A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crept down my spine. A doctor's appointment. My mother's doctor was on the other side of town. It was a lie. A small, but deliberate one. For a moment, I considered calling her back, demanding an explanation. But the old, ingrained desire for peace won out. He texted Jane back. "Thanks for letting me know. Mom just worries too much. I wish I had paid more attention. I wish I had asked Jane what exactly." My mother had been asking the neighbors. That small, insignificant detail would later become a cornerstone of their case against me. The final tremor came that Friday. I had stopped by my parents' house to drop off some mail that had been sent to their address by mistake. As I walked in, I heard my father, Richard, in his study, his voice low and urgent on the phone. "The deadline is approaching," he was saying. "Margaret is handling it, yes. The court just needs to approve, and it will all be taken care of." He saw me in the doorway, and his face went pale. He ended the call abruptly, mumbling something about a business deal. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. Deadline, court, it didn't make any sense. But again, I let it go. They were my parents. I was 32 years old, and I was still programmed to give them the benefit of the doubt, to believe that any strangeness was a misunderstanding on my part, not malice on theirs. That programming, that lifelong habit of self-deception, is why I was so completely unprepared for what happened next. The following Tuesday, I was at work in the quiet, climate-controlled archives of the museum. A courrier arrived, holding a thick, legally important-looking envelope addressed to me. My hands felt strangely heavy as I signed for it. I retreated to my small office, the scent of old parchment and binding glue suddenly suffocating. I slit the envelope open with a letter opener. Inside, beneath a cover letter from a law firm I had never heard of, was a legal petition. My eyes scanned the cold, formal text, but my brain struggled to comprehend the words. I read them once, twice, a third time. They were accusing me of being a danger to myself. They were citing my unusual resistance to cold as a symptom of a deep-seated psychological disorder. They had attached statements from unnamed concerned neighbors and a lengthy, fabricated psychological evaluation. And then I saw the final, devastating sentence. My parents, Margaret and Richard Vance, were petitioning the Superior Court for legal guardianship over me, their 32-year-old daughter, on the grounds of severe mental instability. The paper trembled in my hand. The silent stories of the past surrounding me in the archive were nothing compared to the deafening, monstrous lie that had just become my present. The world didn't rush back in. For a long, silent moment, it remained at a distance, muffled and indistinct, as if I were underwater. The only sound was the frantic drumming of my own heart against my ribs. I sat there, in my quiet sanctuary of history, holding a document that had just declared my entire life. My sanity. A work of fiction. My first coherent thought was not one of anger, but of absurd, heartbreaking confusion. This had to be a mistake. A terrible, cosmic misunderstanding. I drove to my parents' house in a daze. The familiar streets of my childhood looked alien, like a set for a play in which I had forgotten all my lines. When I walked through their front door, they were waiting for me in the living room. A perfectly staged portrait of parental concern. Margaret sat on the sofa, a silk handkerchief clutched in her hand. Richard stood by the fireplace. His expression, a practiced mask of sorrow. Eleanor, darling. My mother began, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. We knew you'd be upset. I held up the petition, the papers shaking in my hand. Upset. You are trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. You're trying to take control of my life. And then, the performance began. The tears started to fall from Margaret's eyes. We're doing this because we love you. She sobbed. We are so worried. Your isolation, your strange habits, your refusal to feel things. We see you slipping away, and we can't just stand by and do nothing. The things you wrote in here, I whispered, my voice hoarse. They're lies. You twisted everything. Did we? She challenged, her sorrow instantly sharpening into a defensive edge. Or did we finally write down the truth you've been refusing to see, Eleanor? This reaction, this paranoia, it's exactly the kind of behavior that proves our point. You're forcing our hand. It was masterful gaslighting, a tactic she had perfected over 3 decades. She took my pain and wielded it as a weapon against me, framing my legitimate outrage as a symptom of the very illness she had invented. My father remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. His silence was his consent. In his complicity, a betrayal as deep as her words. I left their house with nothing resolved, only a deeper sense of dread. The next morning, I found a family law attorney, a woman named Ms. Albright, whose calm, no-nonsense demeanor was a lifeline in my churning sea of chaos. She reviewed the petition, her expression growing more serious with each page. This is an aggressive move. Eleanor, she said, her voice even. Their case is built on a psychological evaluation. We need to see it. A week later, the discovery documents arrived at her office. She called me in, and when I arrived, there was a thick, bound report sitting on her conference table. This is it, she said. The assessment by their expert, a doctor, Marcus Thorne. I opened it, and I felt the air leave my lungs. It was my entire life. Stolen and grotesquely refigured, my childhood love for reading in my room was presented as antisocial withdrawal. My quiet, introverted nature was a flat affect, indicative of schizoid tendencies. My meticulous work as an archivist was obsessive-compulsive behavior. They had even twisted my trauma, stating that my inability to feel the cold was not a physiological anomaly, but a psychosomatic delusion, a sign that I had disconnected from reality. Every memory, every piece of my identity, had been pathologized and turned into evidence for my supposed madness. This is a character assassination. Ms. Albright said quietly, watching my face. It's thorough, and it's vicious. I sat there, turning the pages of my own fabricated insanity, and a cold clarity began to cut through the fog of my grief and shock. This was too much. It was too elaborate, too expensive, too final. This wasn't a desperate act of worried parents. This was a meticulously planned execution. There had to be another reason, and a piece of the puzzle I was missing. That evening, I did something I never thought I would. I drained a significant portion of my savings and hired a private investigator, a retired detective named Frank Davies. I don't know what I'm looking for, I told him over the phone, my voice low. But my parents are trying to destroy me, and I need to know why. Look into everything. Their finances, their connections, anything. For 2 weeks, an agonizing silence followed. The court date loomed. I went through the motions of my life, but I was a ghost, haunting the edges of my own existence. Then, late one Thursday night, as I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by legal papers, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. Miss Vance, this is Frank Davies. His voice was gravelly. All business. Did you find anything? I asked, my heart pounding. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I did, he said, and the grimness in his tone made me go cold. I looked into your family's assets, specifically your maternal grandfather's estate. It seems he didn't trust your mother any more than you do. He took a breath. He left his entire fortune, a considerable one, in a highly complex trust. You are the sole beneficiary, set to inherit everything on your 35th birthday. I don't understand, I stammered. And then he delivered the final, devastating blow. The trust has a peculiar and brutal loophole, Miss Vance, an incompetence clause. It states that if you are ever legally declared mentally incompetent and unable to manage your own affairs, the full control of the trust, and the millions of dollars within it, will immediately revert to your legal guardians. I sank into my chair. The phone pressed hard against my ear. The room began to spin. All the pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, deafening snap. The lies, the manipulation, the staged concern, the fake medical report. It was never about my health. It was never about me at all. Mr. Davies's voice came through the line, pulling me from the wreckage. Miss Vance, he said, his voice softer now, but brutally clear. You need to understand, this isn't just a family dispute. This is a calculated plan to seize millions of dollars. They don't see you as a daughter. They see you as an obstacle. The truth, when it finally arrives, is rarely gentle. It doesn't knock politely at the door. It kicks the door down, shatters the windows, and leaves you standing alone in the wreckage of everything you thought you knew. For the rest of that night, I did not move from my chair. I simply let the pain wash over me in relentless, suffocating waves. It was a grief sharper than any I had ever known. Because I wasn't mourning the loss of my parents, I was mourning the fact that I never truly had them at all. My entire childhood, every act of cruelty, every cold word and colder silence, was not the result of their flawed love, but the cold calculus of a business transaction. I was not their daughter, I was a variable in a financial equation. An asset to be liquidated. Sometime before dawn, the tears finally stopped. The raw, searing agony began to cool, to harden, solidifying into something new. I went to the window and watched the first gray light of morning spill over the city. The world was waking up, oblivious to the death and rebirth that had just occurred inside my small apartment. And in that quiet moment, looking out at the waking world, I felt the shift inside me. The sadness didn't disappear. It just condensed, transforming from a crippling weight into the solid, dense core of a single, unwavering objective. They had mistaken my grief for weakness. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. They were about to learn how terribly wrong they were. The next morning, I made the most difficult and most important phone call of my life. I dialed my mother's number, taking a deep breath and summoning every ounce of the broken, frightened daughter she believed me to be. "Mom," I said, my voice intentionally small and trembling. "Eleanor," she replied, her tone laced with a theatrical sigh of relief. "You're finally calling. I don't know what to do." I choked out, letting a sob catch in my throat. "The lawyers, everything, it's too much. I think you might be right." There was a pause on the line, and I could almost hear the triumphant smirk forming on her face. "Oh, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "I know it's hard to accept, but we're doing what's best. Don't fight it anymore. Just let us take care of you." She thought she had won. She thought the game was over. In reality, I had just made my first move. After hanging up, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. My act had bought me the one thing I needed most time. My next call was to the law firm that managed my grandfather's estate. I was put through to the senior trustee, a man named Elias Abernathy. His voice was old, formal, and wary. He spoke in clipped, legally precise sentences, making it clear he could not and would not discuss the specifics of the trust with me. He was a stone wall. "Mr. Abernathy," I said, cutting through his legalese, "I understand your position, but you should know that my parents, Margaret and Richard Vance, are currently petitioning the court for legal guardianship over me, citing mental incompetence." The silence on the other end of the line was instantaneous and profound. It lasted for a full 5 seconds. When he spoke again, the professional frost in his voice had thawed, replaced by a note of deep, unmistakable concern. "I see," he said slowly. "Miss Vance, I believe it would be prudent for us to schedule a meeting as soon as possible." I knew then that I had found an ally, though I did not yet understand the depth of his loyalty to my grandfather's true wishes. That weekend, I drove to the storage unit where the few remnants of my childhood were kept. I was looking for anything letters, old report cards, anything that could paint a picture of my life that contradicted their narrative of insanity. Box after box was filled with the mundane debris of a life half-lived, and then I saw it. A heavy-duty plastic tote, different from the others, with a label written in a familiar Baiman. "Elegance Crypt." From Grandpa. It read. My heart quickened. Inside, nestled amongst old, leather-bound books, was his old Hi8 video camera. A memory, sharp and clear, surfaced in my mind my 10th birthday. My grandfather pressing the camera into my hands. People can twist words. "Ellie Bean," he had said, his eyes kind, but serious. "But the camera just shows the truth. You keep this safe. One day, it might be more important than money." My hands trembled as I rummaged deeper in the box. And there they were. A neat stack of videocassettes. My eyes scanned the labels. Christmas 9 years old. Summer picnic. Beach trip. And then I saw it. The one that made my breath catch in my throat. The label was simple. Written in my own childish scrawl. Winter, 10 years old. I packed the camera and the tapes and drove straight to the museum. The audiovisual department had an old conversion deck that could play the tapes. That night, long after the last employee had gone home, I sat alone in the dim light of the AV room. The silence was absolute. I picked up the cassette, its plastic casing cool against my skin. I could feel the weight of the past, the weight of the truth trapped inside it. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, I slid the tape into the deck. I took a deep breath, and my finger hovered over the play button as the old machine whirred to life, and the monitor flickered from black to a grainy, static blue. The image on the screen was grainy, a ghost from a past I had tried to bury. A small girl, no older than 10, stood on a snow-covered porch. She was wearing a thin jacket, her face pale. Her lips tinted a deep, unnatural blue. She wasn't crying. She was beyond tears, shivering in a way that shook her entire small frame. The camera, held in her own trembling hands, turned for a moment to show the back door, locked in dark. A voice, sharp and clear, despite the tape's hiss, carried from inside the house. It was my mother's. "An hour more," the voice said. "Perhaps that will teach you to respect your mother's rules." The camera turned back to the girl's face, her eyes wide with a silent, frozen plea. My eyes. I watched the scene unfold, not as a memory, but as evidence. My grandfather was right. The camera didn't lie. The next morning, I sat with Ms. Albright in her office, the video playing on a laptop between us. She watched the entire 10-minute clip in complete silence, her expression hardening with every passing second. When it was over, she closed the laptop slowly. "This isn't just a diary entry. Eleanor," she said, air voice quiet but fierce. "This is what lawyers call irrefutable. We can use this. We will use this." For the first time, a sliver of power, cold and sharp, ignited within me. I had survived their winter, now. They were about to face mine. Our first move was not the video. That was our checkmate, to be held until the final moments of the game. Our opening gambit was more subtle, designed to probe their defenses and sow confusion. On Ms. Albright's advice, we filed a subpoena for the testimony of Mr. Edia, alias Abernathy, the trustee of my grandfather's estate. It was a calculated risk, a signal that we knew more than they thought. The ripple effect was immediate. My mother was at her weekly luncheon at the country club, a performance of upper-middle-class grace. When she received the email from her lawyer, I can picture her perfectly, sitting amongst her friends, laughing at some trivial joke. The picture of a concerned matriarch, burdened by a difficult child. Then, her phone would have buzzed. She would have glanced at it, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. A flicker of pure, undiluted panic in her eyes before she smoothed it over with a practiced air of nonchalance. Abernathy. How could Eleanor possibly know about Abernathy? The first crack in her fortress of arrogance had appeared 2 days later. The second part of our offensive was ready. Frank Davies, my investigator, delivered his full report on their star witness, Dr. Marcus Thorne. It was even better than I had hoped. The man had a documented history of providing expert testimony in contentious family law cases, often siding with the party who paid him the most. He had 2 prior malpractice suits filed against him for false diagnoses, both settled quietly and sealed by the court. "He's not a doctor," Davies grunted, dropping the file on my lawyer's desk. "He's a mercenary in a lab coat." We now had the means to not only dismiss his testimony, but to utterly destroy his credibility on the stand. That evening, as I knew she would, my mother called me. The mask of sweet concern was gone, replaced by a tone of barely concealed fury. "Eleanor," she said, and her voice tight, "your lawyer is being remarkably aggressive, subpoenaing a respectable man like Mr. Abernathy. What? Exactly. Do you think you are doing? I stood in my apartment, looking out at the city lights, the tape from my childhood sitting on my desk like a sleeping dragon. I felt no fear, no guilt, only a profound and chilling calm. I'm simply asking questions. Mother, I replied, my voice even and cool. The kind of questions you should have known I would ask eventually. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her. I simply let the silence that followed hang between us. Thick with everything, she suddenly realized I might know. Then I hung up. The true blow, however, fell the following week in a preliminary hearing. It was a procedural affair, not the main event. But it was where we would land our first decisive strike. My parents' lawyer argued that their request for guardianship was a private family matter, a painful necessity. Then Miss Albright stood up. Your Honor, she began, her voice ringing with clarity in the quiet courtroom. We contend that this petition is not a family matter, but a matter of financial fraud. A murmur went through the room. My parents' lawyer shot to his feet, objecting furiously. But Ms. Albright continued, unperturbed. We have reason to believe this entire proceeding is a pretext for the petitioners to gain control of a substantial trust fund left to my client by her grandfather. Therefore, the petitioner's financial situation is not only relevant, it is the entire motive for this fraudulent case. We move that the court order their complete financial records to be unsealed and submitted as evidence. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, looked down from the bench, her eyes lingering on my parents, then on their flustered lawyer. She had seen the subpoena for the estate trustee. She could sense the hidden depths of the case. Given the gravity of the accusation, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument, and the mention of a significant estate, I find the request to be relevant. Motion granted. That evening, I imagined the phone call between my parents and their lawyer. I imagined him explaining that every bank account, every credit card statement, every hidden transaction was about to be laid bare for us to see. The game had changed. They had come for my sanity and my freedom. Now, I was coming for their secrets. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. Panic, I have learned, is a terrible strategist. It smothers logic and fuels desperation, turning calculated plans into clumsy, reckless actions. The court's decision to unseal their financial records was the stone that shattered my parents' calm facade, and in the spreading cracks, their panic began to show. My mother, Margaret, whose entire life was a performance of unshakable control, refused to believe she was losing her grip. Her response was not to retreat or rethink her strategy, but to double down on the one tactic she truly mastered: manipulation. Her first target was my Aunt Carol, my father's sister. I imagined her making the call in the afternoon. Her voice, a carefully calibrated instrument of distress. Carol, it's a nightmare, she would have said, the manufactured sob already in her throat. Eleanor is being influenced by this awful lawyer. They're twisting everything, trying to make it about money. You know we've never cared about money. We just want our daughter to be well. But Aunt Carol was not one of Margaret's country club friends. She was a quiet, observant woman who had witnessed my childhood from the periphery, and she possessed a healthy skepticism of my mother's theatrics. But Margaret, I can hear Carol asking, her voice gentle but firm, why would Eleanor even know about the trust fund if you hadn't done something to make her look for it in the first place? It just doesn't add up. The conversation would have ended with my aunt offering vague, non-committal sympathies, leaving my mother seething with a frustration she couldn't show. Her web of influence was beginning to fray at the edges. While my mother worked the phones, my father, Richard, made his own desperate move. In his arrogance, he believed he could fight fire with fire. He thought he could find some hidden dirt on me, on my lawyer, on anyone who stood in their way, and in his carelessness, he used his company-issued laptop, the same one he used for his disability claims, to search for and attempt to hire a disreputable data broker. He was looking for a digital ghost to dig through our private lives. Believing his actions were untraceable, a secret whispered into the void of the internet. But he didn't know that my investigator, Mr. Davies, that was not just a retired detective, but also a formidable digital forensics expert. Every keystroke, every search query, every email sent from that laptop was a breadcrumb leading directly back to their door. It was a foolish, reckless mistake, and it was a gift. Armed with the knowledge of their growing desperation, I decided it was time to set a small trap of my own. I had my lawyer discreetly let it be known through back channels that, overwhelmed by the pressure, I was considering a potential settlement. It was the perfect bait, an appeal to their greed and their belief in my weakness. It took less than 24 hours for my mother to call. Her voice was syrupy sweet, the voice she used when she wanted something. "Eleanor, darling," she began, "I heard you might be willing to talk. I'm so glad. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding. Your father and I just want what's best for you. We never wanted the money. You know that. It was only ever about your well-being." I let her finish, listening to the smooth, practiced lies. Then, I deployed my own quiet truth. "That's interesting. Mother," I said, my voice devoid of emotion, "because Mr. Davies has a digital record of father attempting to hire someone to illegally access my private data just yesterday. Is that also part of wanting what's best for me?" The silence that followed was absolute. I had laid the trap, and she had walked right into it. Her declaration of selfless love colliding with the hard, verifiable proof of their malicious intent. I could hear the sharp intake of her breath, the sputtering start of a denial she knew was useless. "I have to go," she finally said, and the line went dead. But the real collapse of their case came not from a phone call, but in the sterile, wood-paneled conference room of a legal office. Ms. Albright had used the information from Mr. Lay, Davies, and the proof of the sealed malpractice suits to schedule a formal deposition with their star witness, Dr. Marcus Thorne. He arrived looking confident, a man accustomed to being paid well for his opinions. That confidence did not last long. I was not present, but my lawyer described the scene to me later. She didn't raise her voice. She simply laid out the evidence, piece by damning piece. First, the 2 prior malpractice complaints. Then, the financial records showing a pattern of him being hired by the wealthier party in contentious family cases. Finally, she produced the logs from my father's computer, showing his attempts to hire the data broker. "So, Dr. Ms. Albright concluded, her voice like ice, we have a pattern of questionable diagnoses, and we have your clients engaging in illegal activities to support their petition. Providing false or misleading testimony in a guardianship case, especially one involving a multi-million-dollar trust, constitutes felony perjury and conspiracy to commit fraud. I am, of course, legally obligated to submit all of this evidence to the State Medical Board and the District Attorney's Office. Unless, of course, you wish to revise your professional opinion." She let the threat hang in the air. Dr. Thorne, the paid-for expert, the mercenary in the lab coat. He went pale. His gaze darted from the evidence on the table to his own lawyer, who gave him a barely perceptible shake of the head. The game was up. He cleared his throat, his professional arrogance completely gone, replaced by the raw fear of a man watching his career and his freedom crumble before his eyes. "I am," he stammered, his voice suddenly thick. "I am withdrawing from this case. Effective immediately." The withdrawal of a star witness days before a hearing is not a minor setback. It is a legal earthquake. It signals to everyone involved, the lawyers, the judge, the opposing counsel, that the very foundation of a case has disintegrated. For my parents, the collapse of Dr. Thorne's testimony was the moment their carefully constructed fiction began to unravel in spectacular fashion. Their lawyer, I was told, was in a state of controlled panic, scrambling to request a postponement that he knew would never be granted. The real drama, however, he was happening behind the closed doors of my childhood home. The blame game had begun. I can imagine the vicious, whispered arguments. My mother, incapable of accepting her own miscalculation, would have been furious at Dr. Thorne's cowardice, at her lawyer's incompetence, at my father's uselessness. Richard, in turn, that would have been consumed by a different kind of fear, the cold, pragmatic terror of a man watching a financial investigation creep closer and closer to his own carefully hidden secrets. The trust that binds conspirators is forged in arrogance, and it shatters at the first sign of failure. Seeing their fortress begin to crumble, I knew it was time to apply pressure to its weakest point, my father. I thought about sending the video to my Aunt Carol, but that felt like a declaration of war. I wanted something more intimate, something that would feel less like an accusation from me and more like a confession from them. I decided to send her the one piece of evidence that Richard couldn't deny, the recording of his own panicked voice, admitting that Margaret was out of control. I sent it in a simple email with a single sentence: Aunt Carol, I thought you should hear this. I'm sorry you were put in the middle of it. It was an act of quiet truth, not aggression. While I waited for that seed to sprout, the consequences of their actions began to ripple outwards. News travels fast in the small, interconnected worlds of law and medicine. The story of a prominent doctor withdrawing from a high-profile case after being confronted with evidence of past misconduct was too juicy to remain secret. Margaret, who had built her identity on a pedestal of social respectability, he began to feel the chill. Conversations would stop when she entered a room at the country club. Old friends were suddenly too busy for lunch. The whispers followed her, the currency of her reputation devaluing with every passing day. She was being erased from the social ledger she valued more than anything. The final collapse, however, came on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Aunt Carol, having listened to the recording of her brother's voice a dozen times, drove to my parents' house. Margaret was out, likely on some futile mission to repair her social standing. She found Richard alone in his study, staring out at the rain. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She simply played the recording from her phone. He listened to his own terrified words fill the quiet room, and, as she told me later, he seemed to shrink, the bluster and denial draining out of him, leaving behind a small, frightened man. She didn't just lie. "Richard," Carol said, her voice filled with a sorrowful finality. "She made you an accomplice to her greed. She was willing to destroy your own daughter for money. And she made our entire family a part of that ugliness. When does it stop?" My father, a man who had stood by in silent complicity for 30 years, finally broke. He was a coward. But even a coward, when cornered, will do anything to save himself. What he did next was a betrayal so profound, so complete, that it dwarfed everything that had come before. He didn't call me. He didn't call his sister. He picked up the phone and called my lawyer, Ms. Albright. I was at the library, trying to lose myself in the quiet order of the archives. When my phone buzzed, it was her. I stepped outside into the damp air, my heart bracing for another crisis. "Eleanor," she said, and I could hear a note of stunned disbelief in her usually unflappable voice. "You are not going to believe this." "What is it?" I asked. There was a pause, and I could hear her take a deep breath. "Your father," she said, "Richard Vance, has just contacted my office. He has offered to give a full deposition. He is willing to testify against your mother in exchange for immunity from prosecution." I stood motionless on the library steps, the phone pressed to my ear. The rain had stopped, and the clouds were beginning to part. The ultimate betrayal had been delivered, not by me, but from within their own crumbling fortress. My mother had lost her expert. She had lost her reputation. And now, she had lost her husband. She was truly and completely alone. The day of the hearing arrived not with a storm, but with a quiet, unnerving stillness. The courtroom was a theater of hushed whispers and formal proceedings, a sterile environment for such a deeply personal war. I sat beside Miss Albright, my back straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. Across the room, my mother sat alone. Her new, court-appointed lawyer looked young and out of his depth. My father was not there. He was waiting in a separate room. A ghost to be summoned, Margaret was dressed impeccably in a dark, expensive suit, a costume of power and respectability that now seemed ill-fitting. She held her head high, a portrait of defiant indignation, but I could see the frantic, hunted look in her eyes. The Queen was on the board, but she was surrounded, and she knew it. Her lawyer's opening statement was a pathetic retreat from their initial scorched earth attack. The narrative of my severe mental instability was gone, replaced by a vague and insulting story of a profound family misunderstanding. He painted me as a sensitive, troubled daughter who was lashing out and being manipulated by an overly aggressive attorney. It was a desperate attempt to reframe their calculated malice as a simple family squabble. When it was my turn to be questioned, I answered every query with the quiet, factual precision of the archivist I was. I did not embellish. I did not show emotion. I simply presented the truth. And the starkness of my calm testimony seemed to agitate my mother more than any outburst could have. I could see her gripping the armrests of her chair, her knuckles white. Then, Ms. Albright began our offensive. She started with the diary. She submitted it as evidence, and pages of it were projected onto the courtroom. Monitors my childish handwriting detailing dates, times, and the quiet misery of being locked outside. Margaret scoffed loudly, leaning over to whisper furiously to her lawyer. "Childish fantasies," she audibly muttered. She was always prone to exaggeration. The jury watched her, their expressions unreadable but attentive. She was losing her composure, just as we had predicted, but the diary was merely the prelude. "Your Honor," Ms. Albright said, her voice steady. "The petitioner claims these documented events are fantasies. Perhaps a moving picture from that time would provide some clarity." A large monitor was wheeled to the center of the room. A technician pressed a button. For a moment, there was only static. And then the grainy, haunting images from my grandfather's camera filled the screen. The courtroom fell into a deep, profound silence, broken only by the faint hiss of the old tape and the sound of the wind whistling in the video. They saw it all. The little girl with blue lips, shivering uncontrollably. The locked door, and then they heard it. My mother's voice, cold and sharp, echoing through the chamber. "An hour more. Perhaps that will teach you to respect your mother's rules. I watched the faces of the jury. I saw a woman flinch. I saw a man shake his head slowly in disbelief. The judge's face was a mask of stone. I risked a glance at my mother. She was staring at the screen, her face a grotesque canvas of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage. The video was not just evidence, it was a mirror, and she was horrified by the monster it showed her. As the video faded to black, the silence in the room was deafening, and into that silence, my mother's voice, shredded with fury, erupted. Unable to contain the narcissistic rage of being so publicly exposed, she leaped to her feet. She deserved it, she shrieked, her voice cracking, her finger pointing at me. She was a difficult, ungrateful child, and she deserved it. It was over. Her own words were the final, damning confession. In the stunned stillness that followed her outburst, Ms. Albright walked calmly back to the podium. She laid out the rest of it with devastating precision, the testimony from Mr. Abernathy about the trust, the evidence of financial fraud, and the sworn deposition of my father, Richard Vance, detailing every step of his wife's conspiracy. The judge looked at the wreckage of my mother's case, then at me. Miss Vance, she said, her voice softer than I expected. Do you have anything you wish to say? I stood up slowly. I did not look at the jury or the judge. I looked directly at my mother for the last time. My voice was not loud, but it filled the silent room. Your Honor, I said, my whole life, my mother used the cold as a weapon to punish me. She thought it would break me, that it would teach me to be weak and compliant. I paused, letting the words settle, but she was wrong. The only thing her winter ever taught me was how to survive her storm. The judge lifted her gavel. The sound it made as it struck the wood was the cleanest, most final sound I had ever heard. The petition for guardianship is dismissed with extreme prejudice, she declared. Her eyes found the district attorney, who had been observing the proceedings from the front row. Mr. Henderson, she said, her voice like steel. I trust you will be opening a criminal investigation into Margaret Vance for felony perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, and child abuse. Based on the evidence and the in-court confession we have all witnessed today, I watched as my mother, no longer a powerful matriarch but a common criminal, collapsed into her chair, her face a mask of utter ruin. The storm had finally passed. A verdict is not an ending, it is a beginning. The judge's gavel was the sound of a door slamming shut on the past. And as I walked out of that courtroom, I felt the first tentative rays of a new dawn on my face. The legal fallout for my parents was swift and severe. My mother, Margaret, was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, felony perjury, and, based on the video evidence, child abuse. She was sentenced to 5 years in a state penitentiary. Her appeals were denied. My father, Richard, in exchange for his testimony, received 5 years of probation and a court order to pay restitution from his share of their assets. Their divorce was finalized before my mother was even transferred. He sold the house, the car, everything, and moved to a different state. A diminished man erased by his own cowardice. Their names, once a source of social pride in their small community, became a cautionary whisper. I did not attend the sentencing. I did not need to. My victory was not in watching them fall, but in finally having the freedom to rise. 1 year later, the world was a different place. Or, perhaps, I was a different person in it. With the help of Mr. Abernathy, I took control of my grandfather's trust. The money when it finally came, felt less like a windfall and more like a responsibility. A legacy of a man I wished I had known better. I used it to honor him. I founded the Abernathy Vance Heritage Preservation Center, a non-profit organization dedicated to the work I loved, housed in a beautiful, historic building downtown. My days were once again filled with the quiet, patient work of mending the past. But now, it was a choice, not an escape. I was no longer an archivist hiding from the world. I was a director, building a future for it. The strange chill I carried in my bones was still there, a permanent reminder of the winters I had endured. But it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a scar, a mark of a battle fought, and, against all odds, won. I received a letter from my mother last month. It came from the correctional facility, her once elegant handwriting now cramped and shaky. It was not the apology I once might have craved. It was a rambling, self-pitying account of her hardships, with a single, clumsy sentence of regret tucked inside. I suppose I made some mistakes. She wrote. The letter ended with a plea. Can you find it in your heart to visit me? I read it, folded it neatly, and placed it in a box. I did not write back. Maybe one day, in a future I could not yet imagine. I would, but not now. Now was my time. The time for healing was a territory I had to claim for myself, and its borders were still being drawn. This afternoon, as I was organizing my new office, I came across the sealed envelope Mr. Abernathy had given me, the letter my grandfather had left for me. My hands were steady as I opened it. The ink was faded, but his handwriting was strong and clear. He wrote of his regrets, of seeing my mother's growing coldness and not knowing how to stop it. He wrote of his pride in my quiet strength. And then I read the final paragraph, the words that would become the true inheritance. He left me. My dearest Eleanor, he wrote, your mother will try to make you as cold as she is. She will use the winter of her own heart as a weapon against you. But you must remember this. Your true strength was never in your ability to endure the cold. It was in the fierce, unyielding warmth within you that allowed you to survive it. Do not let them extinguish that flame. Protect it. Nurture it. Live well. Eleanor, that is the best revenge. I stood by the window of my office, the letter in my hand, looking down at the bustling street below. A single tear traced a path down my cheek. But for the first time in my life, it was not a tear of pain or of sorrow. It was a tear of release, of gratitude, of peace. I thought of the little girl on the snowy porch, and for the first time, I didn't feel pity for her. I felt pride. She had survived. And now, at long last, she was free. When the trust that binds a family together is replaced by greed, its collapse is not a risk, but a certainty. Eleanor's story is a harrowing reminder that the deepest betrayals often come disguised as concern, and that true monsters rarely look like the ones in fairy tales. But it is also a powerful testament to the quiet strength found not in loud confrontations, but in the patient gathering of truth, allowing an adversary's own actions to become their final, inescapable judgment. We understand that there is no pain more profound than being betrayed by those who were meant to protect you. If you find yourself facing a similar battle, remember this: setting boundaries to protect your peace and your sanity is not a selfish act. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. You are not responsible for their actions, but you are responsible for your own healing. And that journey begins with the brave decision to put your well-being first. So we leave you with this question. Have you ever had to draw a difficult line with a loved one? In your experience, where is the line between forgiveness and protecting yourself from further harm? Share your thoughts and your stories in the comments below. Your wisdom might be the light someone else needs to find their way out of the dark.